The British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Between the year 1900 and the year 1964, approximately 800 people were hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
She's been assaulted with a weapon, and there's been more than one blow.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
My father said, "Do you know we've got a murderer in the family?"
Searching for new evidence.
I've always suspected it was a bit of a secret.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? At 3 a.m. on a cold September morning in 1933, a mother, her infant and nanny ran out of their farmhouse to find the garage ablaze. The farm's owner was nowhere to be seen. They tried to call the fire brigade, but the telephone lines had been severed. Terrified and panicked, they sought refuge in a nearby hedge. Later that morning, the police found a burnt-out car in the shell of the garage, and inside were the charred remains of 30-year-old farm owner Frederick Morton. A post-mortem revealed he had been shot. Suspicion soon fell on 35-year-old farmhand Ernest Brown. He was accused of confronting Morton in his car as he arrived home, shooting him with a double-barrel shotgun before moving the car into the garage and setting it on fire. Brown vehemently denied his guilt, but was convicted of his boss's murder. And on the 6th of February 1934, at Armley Jail, Leeds, Ernest Brown was hanged. Now, 86 years on, Ernest Brown's relatives, Claire and her son Archie, are determined to unearth the truth of what happened on the farm that fateful night.
My father was born in 1931. This happened in, I think, 1933, and he was hanged in 1934. So when my father was 2 or 3, you know, his mother's cousin was being hanged for murder.
Claire and Archie are looking to uncover a black hole in their family tree.
They were just struck off.
Nobody wanted to talk about
any
them.
opportunity to not mention them.
This family tree that I've managed to get hold of, it's almost like that side of the family has been written out.
The case against Brown relied on circumstantial evidence and damning witness testimony. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can a new legal team cast the conviction in a different light? Jeremy Dean QC has over 30 years' experience as a barrister, defending high-profile clients. Examining the case for the prosecution is Sasha Was QC, who's brought successful convictions against some of the UK's most prolific criminals. Claire and Archie have travelled to London to meet Sasha and Jeremy, who will be re-examining Ernest Brown's case.
Meeting the barristers today, I guess what I'm really hoping for is to get a fresh pair of eyes on the evidence.
Hello there.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
For me, it's really important that we're going to get 2 people coming and looking at this from an objective point of view.
So tell me, when did you, Claire, first learn about this case?
When I was a little girl, my father said to me, "Claire, do you know we've got a murderer in the family?"
How old were you?
Not old enough, not mature enough to pursue that. How I wish I had done.
Is there anything that troubles you about the conviction?
So the murder happened in September. He was hanged by February.
I know.
After a month delay.
Well, that was quite slow at the going rate.
Was it really?
At that time, yeah.
So what chance then did people really have to gather evidence?
Probably
properly?
none.
Let me tell you what my role is. I'm a barrister who prosecutes and defends. Just because I'm looking at it from the point of view of the prosecution does not mean that I want to uphold this conviction.
I'm a defence lawyer. My principal objective, obviously, is to attack the conviction if it's possible to do that.
Ernest Brown was born into a working-class family in Huddersfield in 1898. And like many of his generation, served in the First World War, where he worked with horses in the Royal Artillery. As a young man, Brown had run-ins with the police, facing charges of being drunk and disorderly and assault. By the time of the murder, Ernest Brown had worked as a horse groom on cattle dealer Frederick Morton's farm for 5 years. The two men had known each other since childhood. But only months prior to the fatal night, Brown had abruptly left Morton's farm, returning days later, but this time as an odd job man. At trial, the prosecution argued this demotion caused Brown to resent his employer. But was Ernest Brown capable of murder? Sasha and Jeremy are starting their investigation by examining the key facts of that fateful evening.
So, Jeremy, this is a case of shooting in 1933. Critical events centre around the 5th of September at the Mortons' farm in Yorkshire. There were only 3 adults and 1 child in the house. So there was Ernest Brown himself, Frederick Morton's wife, Dorothy, her baby daughter, and their nanny called Anne Houseman. At about 9:30, both women were together in the kitchen and they heard the sound of gunshot outside the kitchen window. Brown returned carrying a shotgun, and he said that he had been shooting rats. According to Anne Houseman, Brown was behaving strangely in an erratic manner, and the women were actually fearful of him. The women eventually retired to bed, and then at 3 o'clock in the morning, they were woken up to find that the garage and the barn was ablaze. Police attended, and it wasn't until 9 o'clock the following morning, when the fire had died down, that they went into the garage. They saw Frederick Morton's body in the motor car, but most importantly, they found a gunshot wound to his stomach, which experts at the time estimated was discharged at point-blank range. So, Jeremy, on the face of it, this looks like quite a strong case.
Well, Sasha, I want to get behind the story here, look at the timeline, look at the multiple accounts of witnesses in the context of this case.
OK.
Ernest Brown went to the gallows protesting his innocence. Today, Brown's relatives Claire and Archie want to find out more about how the night of the murder unfolded. They've come to the scene of the crime with Claire's brother Dan, who has researched the case.
Everything's happened in the farm over there.
Just a few yards away over there.
Not far at all.
No.
According to the prosecution, Ernest Brown arrived back at the farm at 8:30 p.m. and immediately got into a heated argument with the farm owner's wife, Dorothy Morton.
At the point in time, Brown takes hold of Dorothy, takes hold of her by her shoulders. He threw her down and banged her head on the floor.
Dorothy then retreated into the farmhouse kitchen, where she stayed with the nanny, Anne Houseman. At 9:30 p.m., the two women heard a shotgun being fired. Was this the assassination of Frederick Morton? Brown entered the house and told Dorothy and Anne he'd shot a rat.
Brown took the gun apart and started cleaning it. He then put the gun into its leather case and put it into the kitchen cupboard, where it's usually kept.
An increasingly agitated Ernest Brown spent the following 2 hours mainly outside the house. And at 11:30 p.m., both the women heard a car being moved with its engine off.
Several minutes later, Brown entered the kitchen and said, "The boss has been in and gone out again." Dorothy and Anne did not hear the car leaving, Brown sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there until after midnight.
The prosecution claimed at some point during the course of the evening, Ernest Brown shot Frederick Morton and later set fire to the garage. Was he attempting to destroy evidence or give the illusion of an accident?
Later on that night, about 3 o'clock, Dorothy and Anne hear a crackling noise, a dull thud, and also some horses stamping and knocking against stable doors. They look out as if they see flames coming out from top of the garage. They telephone the police and fire brigade, but unable to get any response.
The phone line to the farm had been mysteriously cut. Dorothy, Anne, and the baby escaped into the fields, leaving the inferno behind them.
After the fire was extinguished, there was an examination of the garage. It revealed that the 2 cars were completely burned out, a Chrysler and an Essex. In the front seat of the Chrysler was the charred remains of Mr. Morton.
Oh.
It's a pretty dramatic night.
Yeah. Something that struck my mind is, let's say Ernest has just committed a murder by shooting someone with a shotgun. Would you just start cleaning the murder weapon right in front of 2 witnesses? So it seems to me that there's something else going on, that either that isn't the murder weapon or the other 2 already knew about it and he doesn't feel the need to hide it from them.
A key witness called Francis Carwood placed Frederick Morton at a local pub between 8:15 and 8:45 p.m. Dorothy Morton and Anne Houseman corroborated that Ernest Brown returned to the farm at 8:30 p.m. The prosecution relied upon Brown being at the farm before Morton in order to kill him. But Jeremy has uncovered some key evidence that suggests Mr. Morton may have arrived home before Ernest Brown, which might open up the possibility of another attacker.
Maria Jackson has Frederick Morton leaving the Old George Hotel, Garforth Bridge, by 7 p.m. It's only a 4-mile drive from the Old George to the Boot and Shoe. There's no way, based on Maria Jackson's evidence, that Frederick Morton would have been at the Boot and Shoe as late as 8:15 to 8:45. He would have been there much earlier and then home at Morton's farm by no later than maybe 8 p.m. It's clear on the face of it that Francis Carwood's timings are out.
You're presuming that Frederick Morton went straight from Garforth Bridge to Peckfield. We don't know that. And on the face of it, there's nothing I can see which jumps out as being obviously unreliable about Francis Carwood's evidence.
Well, what's unreliable about Francis Carwood's evidence is that if indeed Frederick Morton went from the Old George Hotel to the Boot and Shoe Inn, he simply could not have arrived there as late as 8:15. Frederick Morton would have been home at Morton's farm well before 8:30. And if so, the spectre of someone other than Ernest Brown killing Frederick Morton surfaces.
Whether Ernest Brown or an alternative suspect pulled the trigger may be open to question. But as the barn fire was extinguished and a post-mortem undertaken, the discovery of shotgun pellets and wadding in Frederick Morton's charred remains turned the case into a murder investigation. Ernest Brown was swiftly arrested, and the police went on to recover a shotgun and a spent cartridge case from the farm. Sasha and Jeremy want to explore the ballistics evidence to see if a modern perspective can offer any fresh clues. They're meeting forensic firearms expert Mark Mastaglio to find out more about the murder weapon.
So, Mark, we have a double-barreled hammerless ejector shotgun. Now, tell us about the hammerless ejector, what that means.
May I?
Of course.
Ejector means that when you discharge the gun and you open the breech, the fired barrel will eject the spent cartridge case. So if one brings it to the shoulder, fire the right barrel, click, bang. Opening the gun will now eject that cartridge.
Oh.
Like so.
Have you had an opportunity of reading Robert Churchill's evidence from the trial? He was the firearms expert.
Yes, indeed I have.
And he came to the conclusion that the gun that had been found or presented to the police had in fact caused that fatal injury.
He came to the conclusion that the recovered cartridge case had been discharged in the recovered gun.
And how is it possible to tell that?
What Churchill would have done is to look at microscopic marks on the primer of the cartridge case.
Right. So can I just be clear? Was it as a result of the firing pin imprint on the primer that caused Mr. Churchill to conclude that the gun in question had fired the shotgun cartridge?
That is correct.
Right. Thank you very much.
We know that Police Constable Lamb searched the farm and found an empty cartridge case 27 yards from the garage. Can it be said definitively that the Waddingham shot that killed Frederick Morton came from the cartridge case recovered by PC Lamb?
One cannot say definitively that it did. All one can say is that the recovered wadding and shot from Mr. Morton had been discharged in a 12-bore caliber shotgun.
So what we do know is that was of exactly the same caliber and type of shotgun cartridge. The wadding was found in the abdomen of the deceased.
Yes, there is a chain, potentially, of connections all the way from the gun to the recovered cartridge to the wadding and pellets found in the deceased.
Right. Thank you very much.
As the police investigation gathered pace, a remarkable discovery was made, which framed the events of that night in a different perspective. For 4 years prior to the murder, without the knowledge of Mr. Morton, Ernest Brown had been having an affair with the farmer's wife, Dorothy. Claire and Archie want to explore this potentially game-changing toxic tryst, so they're meeting social historian Dr. Laura King.
Laura, we've found out so far that Ernest Brown was working as a groom. Is his position, do you think that was quite a secure one by then?
Well, it seems in this case it was. He'd been working there for some years. He was the longest-standing employee of Frederick Morton.
Yeah.
And it seems he was trusted for his expertise with horses.
I guess him being trusted with various jobs around the farm means he's going to be spending a lot of time with Mrs. Morton on the farm. So I guess this is maybe through riding is how they started getting to know each other.
That seems to be what's happened, yeah. What's coming out of this court reporting, the press reports, is this growing closer together. They both enjoyed riding, and this affair, we think, seems to have started and progressed over some years in the late 20s and early 30s.
Yeah.
The affair seems to have been the absolute hub of the case. It seems to have played an absolutely central part in understanding whether Ernest Brown was guilty. Hardly anyone at the time would have defended adultery and having an affair, but at the same time it happens all the time.
Yes.
So we know from the divorce courts, we know from the press, we know from family records that people are having affairs left, right and centre. So there's that tension really between the fact that it's very, very common, but also it's very scandalous.
What's obviously happened is he's fallen in love with Dorothy Morton. At one point it seems that love was at least reciprocated by Dorothy, but that, in the end, appeared to be his downfall.
Ernest Brown's trial began on the 11th of December 1933. Dorothy Morton was a key witness. She admitted to the affair, but claimed for the past 3 years she'd been an unwilling participant, painting Brown as an abusive and intimidating character, accusations which he denied. The affair had ended 3 months before the murder, but could the clandestine love triangle have fueled the deadly sequence of events? Sasha and Jeremy want to understand how this could have impacted the behaviour of the defendant, Ernest Brown.
At trial, the prosecution presented quite a lot of detail to the jury about the affair between Dorothy Morton and Ernest Brown. And in fact, when Dorothy gave evidence, she said matters had turned sour as far as she was concerned. Her feelings had cooled. She was no longer as passionate about Ernest Brown as he was about her. So they put that emotional background very much in the forefront to present the jury with a motive as to why Ernest Brown would want to kill Dorothy's husband.
This is not a case where there was a positive, ongoing relationship between Ernest Brown and Dorothy Morton, which would have induced Ernest Brown to want to get rid of Frederick Morton.
The prosecution also relied on a secondary string of motive, which was that Ernest Brown had been demoted by Frederick Morton.
When Ernest Brown gave evidence, he said that he was happy with the demotion because, effectively, he was being paid the same for doing a less pressurised job. So, I'm afraid, demotion by way of motive doesn't seem to me to get off the ground.
The scandalous revelation of Ernest Brown and Dorothy Morton's affair caused a sensation at trial and in the press. But Brown wasn't the only other man in Dorothy's life. Claire and Archie have come to a Yorkshire library to look at newspaper coverage of the time.
There's a mention of Ernest Brown's relationship with Mrs. Morton. And there's various other detail, including, I've got a first mention of another man here, who she may have been canoodling with.
She said she'd been to Wetherby bathing with a man.
With another man.
Yes.
So this is this other man we're
Yes,
talking
she
about
told
here.
me so. Did you ask her that? No. She told me of her own accord.
It's almost as if she's trying to stir up some sort of jealousy, isn't it?
Actually, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look at this, Archie. Look how popular it was. Owing to the limited accommodation, only ticket holders were admitted to the court.
OK.
The thing I've taken away from looking at those newspaper articles was what a big deal the case was. I really hadn't realised that. I've always suspected it was a bit of a secret, and now I know why.
Given the shot that killed Frederick Morton was fired at close range, the barristers are keen to explore whether any of the victim's blood would have ended up on the shooter.
Hello.
Hello, Jen.
Hi.
Sasha and Jeremy are meeting forensic scientist Dr. Jen Guest to find out more.
In relation to the gun that was recovered from Morton's farm, that firearm was examined by a Home Office analyst, Dr. Gerald Roche Lynch. Could you tell us what findings he made?
So Dr. Roche Lynch examines a gun which would have been much like this one, and he finds spots of blood on the barrel close to the muzzle, and those spots of blood were identified to be human in origin. And probably what those have resulted from is what's called backspatter. The force of the cartridge hitting the body breaks the blood up into tiny, tiny droplets, almost mist-like, and they sometimes land on the barrel.
But as regards Ernest Brown's clothing, there's no significant evidence of bloodstaining. Would you agree?
So Dr. Roche Lynch finds bloodstaining on one of Ernest Brown's boots, on the toe cap, and he is able to test that and say it's a small smear of human blood.
So the only human blood found was a small spot on the toe cap of one of Ernest Brown's boots.
Yes, a smear.
But there's no forensic connection that you're able to indicate between the killing of Frederick Morton and Ernest Brown. Is that right?
That's right, and there was no analysis they could have done at that time on the blood to determine whose blood it was.
Ernest Brown's trial lasted 4 days, but the prosecution never established what time Brown supposedly shot Morton. Brown himself maintained that Morton had returned in his car at 11:30. They'd spoke briefly, and Morton said he might go out again. But nevertheless, Brown was found guilty. Whilst awaiting execution, he was visited by Florence Morton, the deceased man's sister, who didn't believe that Brown had told the truth at trial and wanted to know what really happened that night on the farm. Brown initially stuck to his story, but the day before he was hanged, he wrote to Florence Morton, outlining an alternative course of events. Claire and Archie are meeting crime writer Diane James, who's unearthed this significant letter.
This is fairly explosive. Ernest now tells a very different story, which starts off with him bringing this cow back. And as he's getting the cow out, Dorothy says, "I've shot Freddie."
Already, in the past, I have.
Yes. His body's in the barn and the shotgun is in the wash house. Ernest says that initially he can't even believe this, and he's so angry that he shakes her. shakes her so violently that she actually falls on the floor.
So this is the altercation
This is the altercation.
Okay.
A lot of the evening, he's obviously trying to get Dorothy on her own.
Yeah.
Anne Houseman clearly is aware there's something in the air. Dorothy then slips out of the house and begs him to help her. He obviously doesn't realise that Dorothy is playing quite a clever game here now, and getting Anne on side as well. But the issue with this is that the prosecution case doesn't actually work, and all of those reasons support Ernest's story.
Okay.
So the first one is the shotgun.
I was going to ask you about the shotgun, but he seems to quite calmly come in with the shotgun, sit on the table and
start cleaning it
in front of the women.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we didn't understand why.
It seemed a bizarre thing to do.
If you'd snapped and you'd murdered someone, why would you be calmly doing that? Do we know when he might have been shot?
We do. If he'd arrived home at between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, it's the one window where there is no one but Dorothy on the premises. The defence did try to draw attention to it, but it seems that this has all passed the jury by.
So it seems this is all sort of just brushed over during the trial, really. It's
Completely. The defence would have been labouring under great difficulty because Ernest obviously hasn't told them what's really happened.
Yeah.
And he was asked, why didn't
It does
you...
explain that, doesn't it?
Why didn't you tell the truth? And he said, well, I didn't believe I could be found guilty. Because you have to be guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how can you be guilty beyond reasonable doubt if you haven't done it?
You haven't done it, yeah.
This is very clearly a miscarriage of justice.
I can't believe what we've just heard.
What Diane is saying is that there appears to be a reasonably strong case for his innocence.
In his last-ditch letter, Brown claimed that he had lied at trial to protect Dorothy because she had a young child. Sasha and Jeremy are examining the letter's contents.
So in this letter, Ernest Brown is clearly outlining how it was Dorothy Morton who admitted to him that she was the one who had shot and killed Frederick Morton.
Well, Jeremy, we've got to be quite cautious about people changing their account at the last minute, because Ernest Brown may well have believed that it was in the governor's gift to organise a stay of his execution, which was supposed to be taking place the following day. The other thing that immediately springs to my mind is this. If, during the course of the trial, Ernest Brown was protecting Dorothy and therefore blamed himself or put himself in a position where he was going to receive the blame, we must bear in mind that during the trial, Dorothy gave extremely unfortunate and damaging evidence against Ernest, which was completely unnecessary. She told the jury that he was violent, he'd tried to strangle her, he was abusive. All of that would have prejudiced Ernest's trial quite a lot. If Ernest knew that Dorothy had actually committed the murder, he would have had ample evidence with which to attack her as part of the cross-examination in the case. And he didn't do that.
You make a decent point. However, it could still be that despite what Brown claimed were Dorothy's false claims of violence by Brown on her, that at the time of trial, he just couldn't bring himself to implicate Dorothy Morton in the killing of Frederick Morton. It's one thing to dispute allegations of violence, another to accuse the woman of having committed murder, knowing that she'd hang for it if she was convicted.
Ernest Brown's letter to Florence Morton was never sent, as it was prison policy to censor any correspondence which disputed the trial verdict. Ernest Brown was executed on the 6th of February, 1934. Claire and Archie have come to Leeds Prison, where Ernest Brown was hanged.
It's quite a foreboding and intimidating building, I guess.
It gives you a funny
Absolutely.
feeling being stood
It does,
here now.
yeah, it makes-
We've done nothing wrong, we're not accused of anything.
A member of the prison staff here has actually really kindly let us look at the book which details the
Hang on.
execution. So here we go. We've got, on the 6th of February, 1934, and Ernest Brown. There he is.
These are all measurements and things.
So it's, what we've got here is it detailing his characteristics. So he's a male, age 35, and it's obviously got a precise measurement of his height, 5'9½", and his build, which is described as proportionate. His total weight and clothing, and presumably these are all sort of crucial to working out how long the rope needs to be and how long the drop ought to be to make sure the death is instantaneous.
Yeah. It was a bit unreal, I think. It was a bit kind of shocking. And it was the first time where I've started to feel a bit sick, actually. That tension in your stomach, you know, that it's real.
With the judgment imminent, Jeremy is concerned that there may have been errors at a crucial point in the trial.
There are quite a few points in Ernest Brown's case that I feel we need to discuss extensively. And I'd also like to look at the judge's summing up, because that may well be an interesting phase of this case.
Yes, so would I.
It's very important in a case like this to see how the judge dealt with the summing up in order to ensure that there was a fair trial, because this is just the kind of case where without a fair trial, there could be a miscarriage of justice instead, and the summing up will help me to determine into which category this case falls.
Following his execution, Ernest Brown was buried at Armley Jail, Leeds. And in 1990, his remains were reinterred to New Wortley Cemetery. Claire and Archie have come to pay their respects.
We're probably the first people in the family to have come to this spot and seen this.
Yeah. We've gone from a position of really not knowing this existed
Yes.
to finding out some bare minimum facts, and probably us both thinking
It was damning, wasn't it, initially?
Yeah, and then speaking to Diane has probably told us there's a likelihood that he was innocent.
There's a big chance it was innocent.
We were in a position where we were rooting for Ernest.
Yes.
And then suddenly we're stood here looking at what actually did happen. This is a perfect resemblance of that gap in the family tree.
Archie, you're
it's just
right.
nothing. Yeah, all memories sort of just gone.
Yeah.
Sasha and Jeremy have completed their investigation and now must make their submissions to Judge David Radford, an experienced senior Crown Court judge.
The difficulty that Ernest Brown had was the evidence of Mrs. Morton and the evidence of the nanny, both of whom connected him with a loaded shotgun at the significant time.
I'm going to argue that Ernest Brown's conviction is unsafe. I've also identified some significant problems in the summing up.
The alternative suspect theory makes a compelling story, but is it enough for Jeremy to attack the original conviction?
I'm just hoping that Jeremy has managed to dig something up and find something that I just don't know about.
So how are you feeling today?
Really interested in, seeing what's going to happen.
Are you nervous about the outcome?
It's anticipation, but not nervous anticipation. I'm just really intrigued to see what you guys come up with.
There's one particular legal point that I think is of particular interest, but we're going to see the judge very soon.
So if you follow me?
Sasha and Jeremy must now present their arguments to Judge David Radford. With over 14 years as the senior judge to the largest Crown Court in England and Wales, he's tried some of the country's highest-profile murder cases.
We are here today for me to consider the safety of the conviction for murder of Ernest Brown. Mr. Dean, would you like to focus on your development of your submissions?
Thank you very much. We received very helpful evidence from Dr. Jen Guest, who clarified there is no forensic link between Ernest Brown and the killing of Frederick Morton. Can I also bring to Your Honour's attention the terms of a letter written by Ernest Brown on the 5th of February 1934 to Frederick Morton's sister. I submit that it's important new information, and it reads as follows. On my arrival, I saw Mrs. Morton, asked her where the boss was, meaning Fred. She then said, I have shot Fred with the gun. And so this is a letter written by Mr. Brown,
which I submit raises additional concerns that Dorothy Morton was indeed truly culpable for Mr. Morton's death, and that her culpability was not properly explored in the course of Mr. Brown's trial. In the course of the trial judge's summing up, the judge failed to deal properly or adequately with the burden and standard of proof. He then said this: what is called the onus of proof, the burden of proof, is of course under those circumstances upon the prosecution, who allege that he is the person who committed this murder, to prove it to your reasonable satisfaction. Well, I submit that was simply wrong, because of course the obligation on them was to prove the case so that the jury were sure. And this is compounded when the judge said, if this evidence taken as a whole leaves you with a feeling that there is substantial doubt about this case, you will acquit this man. A jury were not bound in 1933 to have substantial doubt before acquitting. So in conclusion, what the judge has done is first to say the requirement is proof to the jury's reasonable satisfaction, and secondly, that they needed to have substantial doubt in order to acquit. Both were wrong, both were misdirections, both were liable to lead to an unjust verdict, both render Mr. Brown's conviction unsafe.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dean. Ms. Wass, do you wish to develop your submissions?
This was a case of deliberate murder. Mark Mastaglio was the firearms expert. What Mr. Mastaglio was able to say is that one shotgun was retrieved, one spent cartridge was found, and that spent cartridge had been fired from the shotgun that was retrieved, and that the shot found in the abdomen of the deceased was of the same type that was found at the premises. Both Dorothy Morton and Anne Houseman had seen Brown in possession of that gun. May I address Your Honour on the letter written by Ernest Brown before he was hanged. Ernest Brown, for the first time, blamed Dorothy Morton for the death of her husband. Firstly, there is no connection at all between Dorothy Morton and a shotgun. Secondly, the fact that Ernest Brown never mentioned this at trial. And Dorothy Morton made a fair and square attack on the character of Ernest Brown at trial, which she would never have done had she had something to hide, and knowing that he had the material with which to blame her. There's no doubt that the judge addressed the burden of proof entirely properly.
Yes.
The wording used, reasonable satisfaction, substantial doubt, deviates from the model direction, but the error does not render this conviction unsafe because it was based on the most overwhelming evidence.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Moss. I shall review your oral submissions and in due course let you know my view of this matter.
Thank you.
The legal arguments have now been presented to the judge. But have Sasha and Jeremy done enough to advance their opposing arguments?
How do you feel about what was discussed?
Well, it's difficult to read. I'm not sure.
Archie, what are your feelings?
I can't sort of put myself on one side or the other. Your point about the direction of the judge is something I never even considered.
No, obviously, and you wouldn't.
That was
yeah.
really interesting, and that was eye-opening.
It's just astonishing, in my view, that the judge at Ernest Brown's trial couldn't get the standard of proof right. It's such a basic and all-important thing. I personally feel that because of that, Judge Radford should say that Ernest Brown's conviction is unsafe.
Did Ernest Brown shoot his employer, Frederick Morton, and then set fire to his body nearly 90 years ago? Or was there, in fact, an entirely different person responsible? Judge Radford is now ready with his verdict.
There can be no doubt that the deceased Frederick Morton was deliberately shot and murdered. The inquiries that counsel have undertaken have included a review by modern experts. Neither the firearms expert, Mr. Mastaglio, nor the forensic scientist, Dr. Guest, have suggested that the experts called at the trial had misdirected themselves scientifically or factually. Mr. Dean is right that there is no clear scientific evidence which can be relied on specifically against Mr. Brown. However, a letter was written by Mr. Brown to the sister of the deceased, but asserted that he had been protecting the true murderer, a murderess, Mrs. Morton. I find what he said in the letter to be utterly belated, never ventilated at the trial, never ventilated in the appeal court, and cannot, given the lack of any other evidence, scientific or circumstantial, which clearly could be said to properly undermine the verdict. Mr. Dean submits to me that there were misdirections by the judge as to the standard of proof, and my attention has been drawn to two passages in the summing up in which the learned judge said the prosecution had to prove it, and I quote the words, "to your reasonable satisfaction." I agree, the precise words used were wrong, but perhaps it, of course, was to be understood that any doubt would have to have been a reasonable doubt. A substantial doubt would, of course, be a reasonable doubt. And no doubt for a doubt to be reasonable, there must be some substance to it. That being my conclusion, I have come to the decision that this is not a case where, in my view, there has been an unsafe verdict. I shall rise.
I think the difficulty was, Claire, that the letter, too little, too late. Do you feel an emotional sense of unrest?
No. I'll tell you how I feel. We've discovered something about our family. I'm now able to go back and finish the job that my father started, really. And that's what I'm taking out of it.
OK, well, that's good. What about you, Archie?
In terms of the judge's findings just now that it was a safe conviction, you know, had he have found otherwise, it would appear that, you know, the real criminal was the criminal justice system.
It was extremely nice to have met both of you.
Thank you very much, Sasha.
Great to meet you both.
Well, the whole experience has been really positive for me. I feel I've been able to get kind of back in touch with parts of my family that I, you know, long lost to me and didn't really know about.